For today's project, we're going to paint the Archlord Discordant. Unfortunately, I haven't got any white to use as the undercoat, so I'm going to have to use black instead. And this means my initial coat of Upshafty bone is going to have to require several more coats than normal to make sure we get a good overall base coat of the Upshafty bone first. Once the Upshafty bone has had time to dry, next we want to use a Screaming Skull for the edges on their main body, followed by using Pallid Witch Flesh. And for the edges on the tail, I've just used the Screaming Skull, and don't try and cover the edges on both sides of the armour plates. Just put the Screaming Skull right down the centre, and the opposite parts of the plates will be picked out later on. And these same colours were used to pick out some of the details on the armour plates for the legs as well. Next, Agrax Earthshade was used for the deep recessed cracks on the armour plates for the legs, and it was also used for the joints in the tail, hence why I was saying before that you didn't need to worry about trying to pick out the details too precise. When the Agrax Earthshade has been applied, that will create that separation between the two joints, so this is the easiest way to paint it. And you can rub your finger over the area afterwards just to remove any excess. Next, Agrax Earthshade was thinned down with Aluminium Medium and then applied to the edges of where the armour is, and this is done so it gives a slight darkness between the area which at the moment is Upshafty bone and what is going to be the edge trim of the armour, and it will help to separate the two colours, because when the overall colours are applied, the colours are quite similar, being the fact it's going to be gold and red. Now you can see the red that's been applied, which is Agron red, and it takes several coats. It will take you at least 3 to 4 coats to build it up, but you can also see how the colours that were underneath that we previously applied will show through this coat of the paint, and it gives a nice shiny reflective colour at the end. Lead Belcher has been applied to all the silver areas, followed by some Runefang steel, and at the very end there's a little bit of Necron compound applied just to try and pick out the details, but I wanted to keep the silvers quite bright. The only exception to this was when I was painting the underside of the tail, in which I basically did the same as what I did with the top side, where I used the light silver to cover in between the pieces of plate, and then null oil was applied into the crevice to separate the two pieces of plate. But this is the only place where null oil was used for the silvers. Here you can see I jumped forward a little bit in regards to painting the gold. Jet Enna's gold was used first, and especially on the more flatter areas you might want more than one coat, especially with it going over black. And after that was dry, Yorick Armour gold was applied afterwards, and I wanted to keep it nice and bright, so I haven't used any colours to try and tone down the golds. The whole goal of this particular miniature is for it to be bright. Normally I find it important to give a good contrast to a miniature, so some areas would be particularly light, other areas would be particularly dark. But with this particular miniature, because I wanted to primarily keep it light, I decided to try and give the contrast in a different way. So for the cables, I started off with Corax white, afterwards applying Uriel yellow, and once the yellow has been dry, I then applied Agrax Earthshade over the cables. This way, although the rest of the miniature looks nice and bright, the cables themselves end up looking dirty, so it gives a bit of a contrast between the sharp cleanness of the rest of the miniature and then the cables being dirty, hence giving somewhat of a contrast between two different types of elements. Afterwards, for the internal parts of the cables, I painted it with Lead Belcher first, and then I applied null oil to the area to finish off the detail, but I did it this way instead of applying the Arax Earth shade at the end, because I didn't want the silver parts to look rusty. I wanted to age the cables, but I didn't want to show rust on the miniature. These parts on the front of the face are organic, so I started off with a couple of coats of Khorne red, being it was going over a black undercoat. It needed at least 2 coats, and then after that I applied a third coat of the Khorne red. This time though, while the Khorne red was still wet, I then mixed in Xurius purple and Upshapti bone with a wet blend technique to try and make it look a little bit more organic. And as you can see, the colour on this part of the miniature does look somewhat different to the rest of the miniature, with the rest of it being so bright and shiny. For the areas of the mucus, I started off with Corax white, and I then applied Seraphim Sepia to the area, and also the eyes had a white scar initially applied, and then a blue shade was applied to the area. For these 3 parts, Xurius purple was applied first, and once it was dry, a thin down pink was applied over the area, so the pink would then naturally want to sink into the recesses. And afterwards the exhausts were applied to this area. However, I've done a separate video before now on how to paint exhausts, so I'll leave that in the description if you're interested in it. And remember to watch part 2 for the rider of the miniature. If you like the video, remember to subscribe to help the channel, and also send links to your friends.